Imagine living with a secret so dark that even the closest people to you don't know the truth. What if, one day, the past comes knocking right at your door? This is the story of a man whose horrifying secret is exposed by the cops, and he has nowhere left to run. Stick around to find out what happens when the truth finally catches up. The knock at the door was too loud, too sudden. John's heart skipped a beat. He hadn't expected anyone, especially not them. He opened the door, trying to mask his shock. Two uniformed officers stood in front of him, their faces unreadable. "Mr. McAllister?" one of them asked, his voice firm but polite. John's stomach twisted. The air felt thick, suffocating. "Yeah," he replied, forcing the word out. His mind raced, heart pounding in his chest. The officers exchanged a look. His breath caught in his throat. "We need to ask you a few questions," the other officer said. John nodded, though his body stiffened. "Sure, come in," he managed, stepping aside. The officers walked in like they owned the place. It felt wrong. It felt like they knew something. Something he wasn't ready to face. The first officer pulled out a file. John's eyes flicked to it, unease growing like a shadow. "What's this about?" he asked, though his voice sounded weak. The officer opened the file. There was a picture. His picture. But it wasn't his usual photo. It was something from a long time ago. John's pulse quickened. The officer laid the photo on the table. "This man," the officer said slowly, "do you recognize him?" John's throat went dry. It was him. From 20 years ago. Before everything changed. Before the secret he buried so deep. Before he tried to forget. "Yeah," John said, voice shaky now. "I remember him." The officers exchanged another look. John's fingers gripped the edge of the table, knuckles white. The air grew colder. The silence was suffocating. "We've been investigating a series of crimes," the second officer said, his voice low. John's mind raced. What did they know? How much had they uncovered? The fear settled in his bones. "Mr. McAllister," the first officer spoke again. "We found something disturbing." John's stomach dropped. His palms were clammy. A cold sweat trickled down his neck. "We have evidence linking you to a string of incidents." His eyes widened. The walls felt like they were closing in. He swallowed, trying to keep his composure. The room seemed darker, the air thicker. Everything felt too real now. Too close. He didn't think they knew. But now they were here. And they knew something. John's mind spun, but his body froze. He had to think fast. Too fast. But there was no time. The first officer pushed the file closer to him. John's eyes darted to the papers inside. He could feel his chest tightening. "How much do you know?" he whispered, barely able to speak. The officers didn't respond right away. They just stood there, their presence heavy. John's thoughts were racing, panicked. The memories flooded back, unwanted. Years of hiding, buried under lies. The secret he thought was safe. But now, they were digging. His heart pounded louder in his ears. "You need to come with us," the second officer said. John's breath caught in his throat. He didn't want to go. He couldn't. His mind screamed at him to run. But his body refused to move. They were so close now. Too close. "We have all we need," the first officer added, his voice cold. John's hands shook uncontrollably. "Please," he begged, his voice cracking. I don't know what you're talking about." The officers stared at him, unblinking. The air between them was thick with tension. John could feel his mouth going dry. This was it. The moment of truth. They knew everything. Or at least they were about to. He closed his eyes for a moment, trying to gather his thoughts. The officers were waiting. He couldn't run. Not anymore. He was trapped in the corner of his own home. The walls felt like they were closing in. The silence was unbearable. "Let's make this easy," the second officer said. John tried to steady his breath. But his hands were clammy, his heart racing. There was nowhere to hide. Nothing to stop them. Mr. McAllister, we need you to come with us. John shook his head slowly, unable to form words. The ground beneath him felt unstable, like it might crumble any second. The officer stepped forward, closer. The final blow was coming. And John realized, with a sickening certainty, there was no way out. The officer's hand was now resting on his shoulder. It felt like ice. John's body tensed, his legs shaking beneath him. He couldn't breathe, couldn't think. Every second stretched, twisted in the air. His mouth opened, but no words came out. The officers stood, waiting, their eyes unyielding. He had to do something. He had to speak. But what could he say? The truth? He wasn't ready to face it. Not like this. The second officer took a step forward. Mr. McAllister, you're under arrest for... John's head spun. He couldn't let them finish. He couldn't let them say it. He snapped out of his frozen stupor. No, he croaked, voice breaking. Wait. The words caught in his throat, but he couldn't stop himself now. He was falling. He was drowning in the weight of everything he had done. The past had come for him, and there was no way to outrun it. I didn't mean for it to happen, he stammered, his voice trembling. The officers didn't flinch. They didn't care for his explanation. They had all the proof they needed. You're lying to yourself, the first officer said. His voice was soft, almost pitying. John's breath came in ragged gasps. The room felt colder now. Everything seemed far away, like he wasn't really there. Mr. McAllister, the second officer spoke again, this time more firmly. You can't hide from this. John could hear the distant sound of sirens outside. He knew, deep down, there was no turning back. The truth was no longer his secret to keep. It was theirs now. They had it all. His chest tightened, his mind reeling with memories he had buried so long ago. The faces of those he had hurt, the choices he had made, all rushing back in a blur. The officers were silent now, waiting for him to speak, to confess, to explain. But there was no explanation that could undo what had been done. John couldn't breathe. He couldn't move. He was trapped in his own skin. And the walls of his house, the walls of his life, felt like they were crashing down. The seconds felt like hours. John could feel the weight of their gaze on him, unrelenting. It wasn't just the officers now. It was everything. His past. His guilt. The fear. His stomach twisted violently. He wanted to run, to hide, but his feet were cemented to the floor. Do you understand the severity of what you've done? The first officer asked. John could barely nod. The words were lodged in his throat. What was left to say? Everything was coming apart. The world outside, the life he had built. It all seemed so distant now. The officer moved closer. His shadow loomed over John. There's no way out of this, the second officer said, voice sharp. We have everything. John's hands gripped the edge of the table. The edges of his vision started to blur. His mind felt like it was splintering. I didn't, John began, but the words felt useless now. They couldn't fix anything. He had no way of explaining. The walls felt like they were caving in, the space too small, too tight. The officers exchanged a look. They were waiting for him to break, to confess, to say the words that would make it real. John's breath hitched. It was too much. The silence between them was suffocating. It felt like the room was closing in on him. He couldn't escape. He couldn't hide anymore. The officer stood still, watching him, waiting. The air felt thick with the unspoken. The truth was inevitable now. And John knew, deep inside, that he couldn't run from it any longer. The secret he'd been carrying, hiding, was no longer just his. It belonged to them now. And with every passing second, it was getting harder to breathe. The air around him felt heavier, suffocating. John's chest tightened, his breath shallow. The walls seemed to close in with every passing moment, the room growing smaller. The officers waited, their silence pressing in on him. He could feel the weight of their expectation, their patience wearing thin. John's mind raced, but his body refused to respond. He wanted to scream, to deny everything, but the words wouldn't come. The photos on the table, the evidence, stared back at him, relentless. Every detail was a reminder of what he had tried so hard to bury. And now it was all out in the open. The first officer leaned forward slightly, eyes narrowing. "You know it's over, right?" he said, his voice low and calm, but filled with certainty. John swallowed hard, his throat dry. He tried to gather his thoughts, but it was like the ground had been ripped out from under him. He couldn't remember the last time he felt so exposed, so small. The secret, the lies, it had all led to this moment. The second officer's voice cut through the heavy silence. "We have everything we need, Mr. McAllister. You're not getting out of this." John's mind spun. His whole life had been a carefully constructed lie, a web of deceit to protect the dark truth he held inside. But the truth was now impossible to deny. It was too late to run, too late to hide. His heart pounded in his chest, his palms slick with sweat. He felt sick to his stomach. He opened his mouth to speak, but nothing came out. The officers waited. They knew he was on the edge. They knew he had no choice now but to confess. The room felt like it was closing in, the walls pressing in tighter with every passing second. John finally lifted his eyes, meeting the officer's gaze. And in that moment he knew there was no more pretending, no more lies. They knew everything. The truth was out. John could feel the sweat trickling down his back, his clothes sticking to his skin. He tried to swallow, but his throat felt like it was lined with stone. The officers stood there, silent, waiting for him to crack. The pressure was unbearable. His mind was numb, a whirlwind of fragmented thoughts and images. Every mistake, every choice, every moment of weakness flashed before him like a horror movie he couldn't escape. He glanced at the door, a fleeting thought to run, but his feet wouldn't move. There was nowhere to go, nowhere to hide. The officers had him, and they had everything they needed. The first officer took a step closer, his presence overwhelming. John's hands clenched into fists, his nails digging into his palms. "Mr. McAllister," the officer began, his voice steady, "it's time to face the truth." John's vision blurred. The past was suffocating him. The things he thought he had buried were rising to the surface, clawing their way out. He could feel the weight of their judgment, their certainty. It was all over. He wanted to scream. He wanted to say something, anything to make it stop. But the words wouldn't come. His breath hitched, his chest rising and falling in shallow gasps. I didn't, he tried, but his voice faltered. "I didn't mean to." The words were useless. Empty. The officers remained still, unfazed by his stammering. They knew. They always knew. The silence grew louder, filling the room with a deafening pressure. John's hands trembled, and he finally let go of the table, his palms slick with sweat. It was pointless. He couldn't deny it anymore. He couldn't hide. He couldn't run. With a strangled sob, John dropped his head, his voice barely above a whisper. "I did it." The words felt like lead in his mouth. I'm the one you're looking for." The officers stood motionless, their eyes never leaving him. The air was thick with the weight of his confession. And in that moment, John felt the ground slip from beneath him. He was falling, and there was no way to stop. John's breath came in short, desperate gasps as the words lingered in the air. His confession hung there like a cloud of smoke, thick and suffocating. The officers remained silent, their eyes unwavering, their presence like a looming shadow. John's chest tightened, every inhale a struggle. His heart was beating so fast, it felt like it might burst out of his ribcage. The room seemed smaller now, like the walls were closing in on him, pressing the truth deeper into his soul. He wanted to look up, to see their reaction, but his head remained lowered, his gaze fixed on the floor. It felt like time had frozen, like the entire world had paused, waiting for what would come next. The officers exchanged a glance, but neither of them spoke. It was as if they were giving him a moment to realize the gravity of his own words, a moment to come to terms with what he had just admitted. "I'm the one," John whispered again, more to himself than to them. The room felt suffocating. The weight of his past, his guilt, crushing him all at once. The sound of his own heartbeat in his ears grew louder, drowning out the silence around him. The officers finally stepped forward, their movements deliberate, measured. They didn't need to say anything more. They didn't need to press him. They had him. He was trapped now. The door, the window, all the escape routes he had imagined were out of reach. And somewhere deep inside, John knew he wasn't going to be able to lie his way out this time. "Mr. McAllister," the second officer said, breaking the silence at last, "you've just made this easier for us." John's mind screamed, but his voice was a fragile whisper. I didn't want it to go this far." But even as the words escaped his lips, he knew it didn't matter. It was too late. The truth had been unleashed, and nothing could put it back inside. The officers moved again, one of them reaching for his cuffs, the cold metal glinting in the dim light. John's legs felt like they might give out beneath him. He didn't fight back, didn't resist. He couldn't. As the cuffs clicked around his wrists, he felt the finality of it. It was over. And for the first time in years, he wasn't hiding anymore. He wasn't running. He was facing it. The truth had come for him. And now it would never let go. The cold metal of the cuffs tightened around John's wrists, and for the first time in years, he felt completely exposed. The weight of the moment was unbearable. The officers didn't say a word as they guided him toward the door. John's legs felt heavy, each step a struggle, as if the ground itself was trying to pull him under. He barely noticed the murmur of voices outside, the sound of the sirens growing louder, more urgent. His world had narrowed to the suffocating space of his mind and the cold metal pressing against his skin. As they moved through the doorway, he caught a glimpse of his reflection in the hallway mirror. His face was pale, his eyes wide and hollow. A stranger stared back at him. He didn't recognize the man in the mirror. He couldn't remember when he had last seen himself so broken. The officers led him down the stairs, their steps steady, their presence unwavering. John's body felt numb, like it wasn't even his own. Everything that had happened, the secret, the lies, the twisted path he'd walked, seemed so far away now, as if it had happened to someone else. He could hear the muffled sounds of the officers talking, but their words didn't reach him. He was too far gone, lost in the overwhelming realization of what had just unfolded. The moment he had dreaded, avoided, and lied to himself about for so long had arrived. And now it was inescapable. The outside air hit him like a slap to the face, sharp and cold. John squinted against the harsh daylight, the world around him moving in slow motion. He could see the patrol car waiting, its door open, ready to swallow him up. The officers motioned for him to get in, and he obeyed, his movements robotic. He sat in the back seat, the door slamming shut behind him with a hollow finality. The engine roared to life, and the car began its steady roll forward, taking him away from everything he knew. The streets blurred by, the faces of his neighbors, the familiar sights of his neighborhood, all passing like shadows. John's head rested against the cold window, his mind still spinning. The guilt, the weight of his actions, crashed over him in waves. The journey ahead was uncertain. But one thing was clear, his life had just been irreversibly shattered. And there was no turning back. The car moved steadily through the streets, the hum of the tires on asphalt a constant reminder of the distance growing between John and everything he once knew. His world was shrinking, the familiar sights of his neighborhood now distant, fading behind him. His hands, still bound by the cuffs, lay limp in his lap. John's eyes stared blankly out the window, but He didn't see the streets or the people passing by. All he could see was the past, the faces, the moments, the things he tried to bury. Every wrong decision, every lie, all the secrets that had now come to light. The officers sat in the front, their conversation muffled, distant. John couldn't focus on anything but the overwhelming silence that filled the car. The world outside seemed so normal, so unaware of the destruction he had caused. And yet, inside, everything had shifted. The car took a sharp turn, heading toward the outskirts of town. John could feel his heart pounding in his chest, each beat a reminder of the irreversible step he'd taken. His eyes closed, and he let the weight of the moment settle over him. What now? What was waiting for him on the other side of this? The question circled his mind, but there were no answers. No escape. He was trapped in this moment. There was no place for him to hide anymore. And yet, in some strange way, the truth, painful as it was, felt like a release. It had been years of running, of pretending, of living with the heavy weight of a secret that had shaped every decision he made. And now it was over. The truth had come out, and he couldn't take it back. But there was no relief, no sense of freedom, just an overwhelming sense of dread. The car began to slow, the destination now in sight. John's pulse quickened, his breath shallow. This was it, the place where everything would change. The officers pulled into a parking lot, the cold concrete stretching out before them. John didn't need to be told what was coming next. The door opened, and the officers gestured for him to get out. John took a deep breath, his body stiff, his movements slow. He stepped out of the car, the cold air biting at his skin. The building in front of him loomed, a sterile, imposing structure. It was a place he had never imagined he would end up. But now it was his reality. The officers moved ahead, guiding him toward the entrance. John's feet dragged with each step. And with every movement, he felt the weight of the truth pressing down harder. It was over. And he was finally facing what he had spent years avoiding. The doors to the building opened with a soft click, a quiet sound that seemed to echo louder in the hollow pit of John's stomach. The officers led him down a long hallway, their footsteps steady, measured. John's own feet barely moved, the weight of what had just happened pressing down on him like a 1,000-pound stone. His eyes focused on the ground ahead of him, unable to look up, unable to face the reality of where he was. Everything had happened so fast, and yet it felt like time had stretched endlessly since the moment the officers knocked on his door. They reached a door at the end of the hallway, and one of the officers opened it. It was a small room, bare, unwelcoming. A single metal chair sat in the center, a harsh fluorescent light above casting an unforgiving glow. "Sit," one of the officers said, his voice cold, and John obeyed, his body moving on autopilot. He sat in the chair, the metal biting into his legs as he slumped forward. The door clicked shut behind him, leaving him alone in the stark silence. He could hear his heart pounding in his chest, louder now in the stillness of the room. His thoughts were a jumbled mess, flashes of memories colliding with each other, each one a reminder of the life he had lost. The door opened again, and John didn't look up. He didn't want to see the officers, didn't want to face the reality that this was where his life was now. A voice broke through the silence. "Mr. McAllister." It was the officer who had spoken earlier, his tone no longer just firm, but laced with something else. Something like pity. "You're not the man you used to be, are you?" John's breath hitched, and he raised his eyes slowly, meeting the officer's gaze. No words came, but the truth was there in the silence. "I didn't mean for any of this," John whispered, his voice raw, cracking with emotion. "I know," the officer said softly, "but it doesn't change what you've done." John lowered his head again, the weight of the officer's words sinking deep into his chest. There was no escaping it. He was here now. He was facing the consequences. And deep down, despite the fear, the guilt, the regret, he knew that this was the only way forward. The truth was out. And now, there was nothing left to do but face it. The silence in the room felt endless. John sat, his hands still bound by the cuffs, staring at the cold, concrete floor beneath him. His mind was a blur of fragmented memories and emotions he couldn't untangle. Every moment of his life, the lies, the secret, the choices, had led him here, to this sterile room, to this painful reckoning. For the first time, he didn't feel like he was running anymore. There was no escape, no way to hide, no way to fix it. The door opened again and 2 more officers stepped in. They didn't need to say anything. John already knew what was coming. He was going to be processed, booked, and taken through the system. But in the back of his mind, he realized that it wasn't just the law he was facing now. It was himself. His past had finally caught up with him, and it was as if the weight of all his actions had come to rest on his shoulders. He had carried this burden for years, pushed it into the deepest corners of his mind, buried it beneath the layers of his everyday life. But now, with no distractions, no place to run, the truth was all he had. He felt empty. And yet, in a strange way, he also felt free. Free from the lies. Free from the fear. Free from the constant, gnawing worry that someone would find out. For the first time, he could breathe. But it wasn't a relief he could savor, not yet. Not with everything that had been lost, not with everything he had destroyed. The officers began their routine, taking the cuffs off and running through the motions. John didn't fight it.
He didn't resist.
He was numb, but in that numbness, there was a strange calm. They were right. He had done it. He had no one to blame but himself. They didn't offer him sympathy, didn't ask for explanations. They didn't need to. He had already told them everything. The truth was his to own now, and in the quiet of that room, John realized that even though it was the end of everything he knew, it was also the beginning of something else. A chance, finally, to face what he had become. And perhaps to start over.